Hello, everyone. I'm just getting everything set up. Say hi if you're joining live and hashtag replay if you're watching this on replay. It's nice to see who's watching and getting a sense of that. And Facebook doesn't tell me, like, even live, who's watching. So someone's like blind. Yeah. So say hi if you're joining live. So I'll just introduce myself so long. So as most of you know already, I'm Sarah, health and recovery coach for women clinicians. And I like to say that magic happens when women clinicians are deeply healthy, energized, and lit up by the work that they do. And that's the work that lights me up. So today's topic is about stress and anxiety. And we're going to go a little bit into the differences between the two, as well as some ways that we can think about it a bit differently, and kind of tools that we can use on a daily basis, and then as more like of a general sense as well. So I'll just wait a minute or so if anyone still wants to join live. And I also just wanted to remind you guys, a lot of the live sessions, I'm also kind of broadly touching on a few topics within that bigger topic. And so if there is something that resonates with you, or that you feel like, oh, that applies to my life and I'd want a little bit more support on that, you can just book a free mini coaching session, and we just take that topic and we coach you on that. And I call them mini coaching sessions just because we're not trying to like look at your whole life and career, right? We're just trying to pick one specific thing that you're struggling with, and we coach on that. So with this live and any other live that I do, let's say, for example, I mentioned something about stress and sleep, and you say, oh, that's something that I struggle with. I want to book a session on that. Or social anxiety. Oh, that's something I really struggle with. Let me talk about that. Or something happens with a patient, and that's when your stress response gets activated. And we coach on a specific example of that. So to see kind of what is actually going on in terms of how you're thinking about it, your coping strategies, etc. So just a reminder that that is available at all times. They are free half-hour mini coaching sessions, and that link is in the group description, and it is available to everyone in this group at all times. So whether it's in relation to a live, or whether it's just in relation to something that you notice, oh, I'm struggling with this, or this seems to really trigger me in practice, you can just book a mini coaching session with me. So just a reminder of that. And then we'll go ahead and get started on this topic today. So before we start, I wanted to just do a little bit of a reflection exercise, as we sometimes do in these lives. It just helps for you to kind of get an idea of how you think about it before I go into all the kind of different aspects about it. So either thinking about it or writing it down. You can also write it in the comments. It's great to see other people's responses as well. So the reflection is, if you think about the word stress, what comes to mind? So what words come to mind? What associations do you have with the word stress? What kind of comes up when you think about the idea of stress? And you're welcome to type those in. I think for me, stress feels like, I can't handle this. When I struggle with anxiety, it's mainly social, or when I have struggled in the past, it's mainly been social. That is much better now, but I used to struggle a lot with social anxiety. So when I think about stress, I also think about the situation, which is usually involving other people. And also related to that, sometimes you'll have a specific type of person that you can think of. Or for example, if you think of a specific situation in practice, for example, you might immediately think of a certain kind of patient that tends to have the relation to stress. And then think about like, what are your common coping mechanisms for stress? So when you feel stressed, what do you tend to do in terms of coping mechanisms? Do you go and work out? Do you speak to a friend? Do you go and have a drink? Do you scroll on social media? Like, what are your kind of typical go-to coping mechanisms? And just reflecting on that, either writing it down for yourself or just thinking about it, writing it in the comments. What are your typical coping mechanisms when you are stressed? And then thinking about your typical coping mechanism and habitual behaviors in relation to stress. If you had to think about 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, what do you think is going to be kind of the end result of the way that you habitually cope now? Like, is it something that feels like it would be healthy for your future? Like you can keep going like this forever and it will be fine? Or it actually be like healthy or good? Or do you feel like the way that you typically tend to process or deal with stress, that if you think about a longer term idea of that, you realize like, oh my gosh, that is not going to be healthy for the long term, whether that's in terms of like your own health, let's say, like, for example, if it's a drinking habit, maybe that's what you think of, like your physical health. Maybe it's certain relationships, like when I'm stressed, I tend to rant to my husband, or I tend to take it out on my friends and I like blow up at them or whatever. And maybe if I keep doing that for years and years, that is going to affect my relationships. So just kind of thinking of the long term, like what does it feel like the long term ramifications are of the way that you handle stress? And again, feel free to type that in the comments, or just reflect on it for yourself or write it down for yourself. So just having all of these things in mind, like a little bit of a reflection on like, what do I think of when I think of stress or anxiety? What do I associate it with? What kinds of people or situations? And what are my typical coping mechanisms? And are those typically quite healthy coping mechanisms? Or are they, when I look at the long term, going to be problematic in the long term or unhealthy in the long term? So I wanted to just differentiate between stress and anxiety and fear, because we tend to kind of use them a little bit interchangeably, and there is a lot of overlap. So stress generally is like, if you think of just the actual word stress, it just means a response to a stressor, right? Something external, an external kind of stimulus or an internal stimulus, but some kind of stimulus happens, and then we have a stress response to that. So that can be sometimes good things, sometimes bad things, and sometimes neutral things, but something is physiologically kind of activating a stress response. And anxiety and fear are more kind of, they have a more kind of cognitive and behavioral aspect to them. They're not like a straight up stress response. And the reason it can often be, and then just differentiating between anxiety and fear, they are similar things, but fear tends to be more specific, like I'm specifically fearful of this, whereas anxiety kind of is more kind of vague or kind of general. But both are some sort of, what do you call that? Trying to think of that word. anyway, there's some kind of future threat that you are anticipation. Anticipation was the word I was looking for. So anticipating a future threat. And the reason they can overlap so much is if you think about a stressor happening and you having a stress response, anxiety or fear could be part of that physiological response that you're having to that stressor, right? And then also anxiety and fear itself, like when we're experiencing anxiety or fear, that can be a stressor in and of itself, because we notice, oh, I'm feeling anxious, and that produces an increased stress response. So that's why they can almost be used interchangeably. I will kind of differentiate or go into them slightly separately today, but in an overall sense, you can kind of think of them as fairly similar phenomenon, or at least related to one another. So if we think of stress as just a response to stressors, then we can think about it as like sometimes stress can actually be good, right? So sometimes stress helps us change, it helps us adapt, it helps us build new skills, right? Like if you are wanting to do something that you care about, or something that is really important to you, or a future goal, right? Sometimes there's going to be stress, sometimes there's going to be challenge, sometimes there's going to be new things. But those things are kind of a good stress, right? And then a bad stress, more related to something that is kind of degrading your physiology or your mental state. So what determines whether stress is good or bad? So there's just the pure intensity, like sometimes it's so intense that it's completely overwhelming to ourselves, like mentally and physically. And sometimes it's just chronic. So it's not particularly intense, but it just never ends. It's just constantly coming. So the intensity and the chronicity of it, things like our mindset about stress, like that was kind of what I was alluding to with what do you associate with the word stress? Like, do you associate bad things with stress? Like stress is always unhealthy, or it's bad for me, or I must have as little as possible. What is our mindset around stress? And that tends to be like a little bit of a feedback loop with how we cope with it, right? So if we believe that stress is bad, we will feel more stressed when we have stress, or feel more anxious when we have stress. We will try and avoid it as much as possible. We will have negative responses to that stress because we believe that it's a negative thing, and that kind of keeps this feedback loop. Whereas when we believe that it's something that's helpful to us, that it is a challenge that we're meeting, and we're like, yes, come at me, like I'm ready for you type thing. Or this is something that, this is the direction I'm trying to grow in. This is a direction that's really important to me, right? Like speaking up against someone who is treating you like crap, for example. Like that might be a very stressful situation, but it's very important to you, and you don't want to just avoid that, right? So how we think about stress and whether it's good or bad or helpful tends to kind of create a feedback loop from how we actually then cope with stress. And our coping can be adaptive or maladaptive, or if you think of it as like healthy or unhealthy. And healthy coping with stress just means that the way that we engage with it builds us up rather than breaks us down. So if you think about things like approaching the stressor instead of like ignoring it, pretending it doesn't exist, which usually makes it just get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? We're going towards it. We are approaching it. We are building the skills. We see it as like a growth thing, right? Like I can learn to handle the stressor better. And as I practice, it will get better. Things like coming up with creative ideas of like, how might I be able to handle this better? How might I be able to do this differently in the future? And unhealthy coping mechanisms or maladaptive coping mechanisms can be things like avoiding it completely, pretending it doesn't exist, numbing out, whether that's like scrolling social media or, drinking excessive alcohol or using food to cope with the stressor. And then things like in terms of thought, instead of coming up with creative solutions or ideas to that, we, like I said, either just completely ignoring the fact that it exists, or we're so kind of stressed out and seeing it so negatively that our cognitive abilities are severely limited. And we're so focused on our distress and how we are experiencing it negatively, and we're not really focused on getting a solution or, you know, building our way out of this, the stress. And then there's something called our stress appraisal, which essentially is like our assessment of the stressor. And when we encounter something that, or when we encounter a stressor or a threat or a challenge, we essentially look at the perception that we have of how big the demand is or how big the stressor is, and then how many resources we have to cope with it. So we're almost like looking at these two in relation to each other. So if we perceive that the demand is very high and we can't really cope with that, then we're going to see it as a threat. Whereas if the demands are really low or relatively seen, our resources are really high, then it's like a challenge, like, yes, I've got this. And think about the kinds of things that might lead you to thinking that the demand is very high, right? As someone who struggles with anxiety, you might be someone that overestimates the likelihood that something is going to be really bad and how bad it's actually going to be. So you, in some sense, overestimating the demand, and the demand can be related to like how much effort it's going to be, how hard it's going to be, how familiar it is. All of those things can make you think that or assess the fact that it's demanding much higher, or to assess that it's demanding at a very high level, right? This can also be things like idealism or high expectations, right? If you see, let's say you have a task at work and you expect yourself to do it at this level, it immediately becomes so much more demanding than someone else who doesn't have those same expectations of themselves or that idealism around how things should happen or how good they should be. And then thinking about the other aspect of that equation, if you think your resources are very low, and those can be internal or external, right? So internal resources being like, how much do I feel capable of handling the stressor? And then external being like, how much support do I have to engage with the stressor? So you might have a very, and anxious people also tend to have a very low estimation of how much they can handle something. So at this, we are simultaneously overestimating the demand and underestimating our ability to cope with it. So you can see how we would be more likely to be stressed when facing a situation than someone who doesn't have those very different assessments of the two. So thinking of anything where the demand, it would make the demands higher or would make your resources lower. And similarly, when we are trying to cope with stress, we use what's called reappraisal, which is just kind of trying to balance those out in a different direction. So either you're trying to decrease the demand, or you're trying to increase your ability to handle that, whether that's reaching out for external support or whether that's having more internal resources. And sometimes those kind of internal resources are just having your own back, right? Like if you think about someone else supporting you, you can be that for yourself. So just a story on this. So one of the things that we can often encounter as a clinician is that something happens in our practice that we get really anxious that we did something wrong. And I had this situation, of course, it's like a Friday afternoon patient, and you know, you're not in practice for the weekend or whatever, and the whole weekend I'm just like spinning out mentally. about this patient, tried to contact them, and they didn't answer, which just like, increases the stress. So like I'm having this huge stress response. And I remember just saying to myself, like the person that needs to have my own back in this is me. And yes, I can get support from my boyfriend, or, have support from my boss, or whatever it is. But just that shift of like, we often are for ourselves just another element of stress, right? Or just not helping ourselves. Like we go like, why did you do that? What is wrong with you? How could you be so stupid? Like you always do this, or you never do that, or whatever it is. Like we beat ourselves up internally, which not only is not supportive, right? So then we don't have those internal resources that we need to cope with that demand, but also we are just adding another form of demand or stress onto our load already. So that's just something we can always access. And I think that's something that we can, that is really important for us to build, is that internal sense of resourceness. I don't know if that's a word, resourcefulness. Resourcefulness, like we already have that. Anything that we need, we already have internally, and we can look to ourselves for support, for comfort, for encouragement, right? We need to be that for ourselves instead of another form of stress or something that is not supportive. Where did I want to go next? So those are kind of the factors determining like whether a stressor is healthy or unhealthy: the intensity, the chronicity, your mindset around it, whether you adapt or whether you use adaptive or maladaptive coping, which is often related to your mindset. They tend to be kind of a little feedback loop. And then your appraisal, your assessment of the relationship between the demands and the resources. Okay. So essentially, if we look at all of that, we're not necessarily always trying to just eliminate stress out of our lives. We're not trying to just always be have less stress or less challenge, right? What we are, or let's say sometimes stress management is about decreasing our stresses, or decreasing how big they are, how intense they are, how chronic they are, etc. Sometimes we're choosing which stresses we want in our life, like which ones are important to us, which ones are going to help us grow in the direction that we want to grow, which ones do we care about and are in the direction that we want to go. And then when we can't remove a stressor or choose which ones we want and don't want, then we are looking more at like, how do we respond to it? How do we cope with it? So stress management can be different things, right? And then there's this idea of like deep stress and deep recovery. So sometimes we are looking at the stressor itself and trying to like change our mindset, or change how stressful that is, or remove that stressor, or whatever it is, or trying to increase our ability to handle that particular stressor. But we can also think about it as a more general sense. So we talked a bit about this quite a bit in the workshop, of that idea of like a full or empty cup, right? Sometimes we're just trying to increase our cup generally, just so that we generally have more resources in order to be able to cope with stresses. So we can look at areas like, how can we fill our cup? How can we increase our capacity for stresses in a more general sense, right? Looking at our other areas of health, like how can we use our physical health to support this area of our health? How can we, use our relational health to support this? How can we generally, in other areas of our health where we maybe have more control or have more resources, how can we use that to just generally have more capacity to handle stresses? And the same is true in the other direction, right? So thinking about deep recovery, that's thinking about like all the areas of your health can support each other and make it easier to cope with certain things. And the opposite is also true. So having stress in one area can make the other areas, you can almost have like a downward spiral or like a vicious cycle, or you can have an upward spiral or a virtuous virtuous circle. And in the one of the examples of having deep stress, or like having a stress that affects others, is, for example, something like sleep, right? So if you think about it, if you are stressed out, you are more likely to be mentally and physiologically aroused in a way that doesn't help you sleep. So then you get poor sleep. And then other things are affected by your poor sleep, right? And that can sort of start to spiral. Sleep in and of itself can be a stressor, right? Poor nutrition in and of itself can be a stressor. So all of these things can influence each other in a positive direction or a negative direction. And I like to think about it as we just have so much more opportunity for recovery than we may initially think, because we often think about only of engaging with that specific stressor. And sometimes we just don't have the ability to change that specific thing, but we can make the all-around health supportive of that, and that you have more capacity and resources in order to cope with that. Okay, so then more kind of like specific tools. So this is in general, breathing exercises are really helpful for more like in the moment anxiety. You can also use them in between, but it's more like when you are actually stressed or anxious, breathing exercises can be extremely helpful. And the one that has the quickest effect, and you can actually use like in your client or patient interactions, or in between them, because it doesn't need to be audible breathing, right? So all of the breathing exercises, one of them is like box breathing, so just breathing the same amount of time in, same amount of time holding, same amount of time out, and then holding again. Something just as simple as like being aware of your breath, right? Because we're just trying to bring ourselves back to like where we are instead of where we're spinning out mentally. Sorry, so the one that I wanted to talk about that is the most effective is the physiological sigh. If you listen to Andrew Huberman, you might have heard this term before. It was actually discovered like really long ago, I think in the 30s or something like that. And then he was saying Dr. Feldman, he's a I think neurobiologist, and he specifically focuses on breathing. And he kind of brought it back to life, this idea. But if you think about our breathing, we often are told to take a deep breath. But when you focus on the inhale, what happens is that your diaphragm lowers, your chest cavity gets bigger, your heart slightly expands, and you have more volume available in your heart. And relatively, then you have less blood flowing, and your brain tells your heart, basically, this is like an oversimplification of physiology, but tells your heart to increase the heart rate, right? So when you focus on the inhale, you are more likely to increase your heart rate. When you focus on the exhale, then you are doing the opposite and you're slowing down your heart rate. So actually, when we are thinking about calming ourselves physiologically with breath, we want to focus on the exhale and not on taking a deep breath. A physiological sigh kind of combines these two ideas. And when we take an inhale, we are expanding the alveoli. When we take a little extra sip of air at the top, so think about like inhaling and then just a little inhale at the top, then we're fully expanding those alveoli to as far as they can, so that when we exhale, we are expelling as much carbon dioxide as possible. And we want to slow that exhale right down. And you can do this a couple of times. This is the quickest and most effective way to calm yourself physiologically. You take an inhale, little sip at the top, and then slowly exhale. So you're essentially taking a double inhale and then a long exhale. And you can use this in your practice. You can use it. This is a great thing to have as a tool for in the moment like I'm feeling really stressed out or I'm feeling anxious, and I just do a couple of those physiological sides. You might, if you have like a dog or a little kid or something, you might see them doing this automatically. You also do it in your deep sleep quite naturally. So this is something that just happens naturally physiologically, but it's also something that we have conscious control over, that we can actually access as a tool. Okay, and then there's this idea of like, so there's breathing. There are obviously many tools, but I just kind of picked a few. The other idea is like completing the stress cycle. So if you think about like us in the wild, when we had our stress response activated, there would have been most likely a threat, right? So we're being chased by something, something's about to eat us, something's about to attack us, whatever. We have a stress response. In the wild, we have to have some or other signal to the body that it is safe again. And actually some animals will do like a shaking, or they'll like pace up and down, or they'll do some kind of like movement. And we can access the same thing. So in the bigger sense of in the like bigger cycle of it, we are engaging with the stressor, we're having that physiological response, and then we want to let our body know, okay, the threat has passed, it is safe again. And you can do that with different ways, right? If you think of something like dancing, or if you think of like just moving your body, often in a very like kind of loose way, shaking out. If you think of every physiological reaction to stress, it's usually kind of contracting, it's usually tense, and we want to kind of do the opposite of that. You can think of your vision, instead of being very narrow and focused on something, let it widen, let it kind of take in the peripheral vision. These are all signals to your body. It's safe again, we can relax, and it kind of completes that stress cycle. The last thing that I wanted to touch on was a little bit more about anxiety. So these ideas are from Ellen Vora, and she's a psychiatrist. She calls herself like an integrative psychiatrist, and Britt Frank. So both of them agree on this idea of like, anxiety itself is not the problem. So Britt Frank uses this idea of a check engine light. So when your little engine light comes on, you don't go like, oh, I need to get this light off, right? You go like, oh, I wonder what's happening in my engine, right? Unless you like don't have money to fix your car, and you're just like, could you just put this light on? But usually your concern is like, what's going on in the engine to make this light come on, right? Not, let's get this light off. And if you can approach anxiety in a similar way. We're not just trying to always reduce anxiety. We want to see like, what is this anxiety trying to tell us? And Ellen Vora, I'm not sure on the pronunciation of that, but she kind of differentiates between what she calls false, not because it's less horrible, but just because of the mechanism of it, which I'll explain now. So like false anxiety, and then what she calls true anxiety. So false is essentially body-based anxiety. So think about it, if you engage with some other stressor and it produces a physiological stress response, your brain is going to then try and interpret that physiological stress response, right? It's going to make meaning out of that stress response. It's going to be like, oh, maybe I'm stressed because of what my boss said, or what happened with the patient yesterday, or whatever. We're going to make meaning around that, but it started in the body. The most obvious example, or the one that we'll most be familiar with, is coffee, right? So especially if you're very sensitive to caffeine, think about the physiological effects that caffeine has, and how a lot of people feel anxious when they've had caffeine. And this is the mechanism behind it. Your body has a physiological stress response because of the caffeine, and then you feel anxious, and you might relate that to some other story, or you feel anxious. And that is like a body-based origin of anxiety. And that can come from different things, right? Like sleep deprivation, poor sleep, scrolling social media, so having a lot of like input. Sometimes it's not necessarily social media, but just like messages and emails, all these like inputs that you feel like, oh, I need to deal with this. It can be things like caffeine, right? It can be things like alcohol. It can be things like poor nutrition or your gut microbiome not being healthy. It can be all of these things that like signal physiologically to your body like something's not right, and then your brain will kind of interpret those signals and make meaning out of it, and that usually feels like anxiety. So sometimes we want to just look at our lifestyle, especially in the modern lifestyle. We have a lot of environmental things and behavioral lifestyle factors that can actually create body-based anxiety. And then there's what she calls true anxiety, where it's more about like something is not in alignment for me, right? Something like I'm lacking meaning or I'm lacking purpose, almost like this bigger compass of your life to say like something is not going well, right? Something is not, things like purpose or meaning, or I'm not living in alignment with what I really believe is important. It can sometimes come as like an existential anxiety, or that anxiety that we have when we realize like I'm going to die one day, or the people that I love are going to die one day, right? It's like a bigger, deeper reason for our anxiety. And sometimes it can be a signal for us to look at like, where am I maybe not living in alignment with what I think is important, or what I find meaningful, or the purpose of life, or whatever it is. Like sometimes it can be deeper, and sometimes it can be more kind of lifestyle and behavior based. So I hope you found that helpful. As I said, we're kind of touching on a few areas. If there's a specific thing that you want some support on, book a mini coaching session with me, and we can dive into that specific area that you find relevant and that resonated with you. Thank you so much, guys, and let me know in general in the comments what resonated with you, what you struggle with, and I also use all the feedback you guys give me as to where I can direct future like lives and posts and stuff like that. So that is always helpful. Thank you, guys. Have an awesome Sunday, and I will chat to you soon.